Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Books I Should Have Read a Long Time Ago, desultorily chosen based on how I feel at the time of picking the book. Or in this case, let's just hit Book 8 of The Arabian Nights, which, as I've said in all the previous ones, this isn't the cover of the version that I'm reading. This is just a prettier cover than what you get off of Gutenberg. So, Book 8 is a book filled with people who constantly faint. There's a lot of people who, when caught up in the raptures of love, and we'll talk about the raptures of love in just a second, they can't stop saying poetry and then passing out. In point of fact, at the start of this, we have the story of a young man who, in the due course of events, falls in love at first sight. We'll call it love because otherwise the story becomes really, really reprehensible. And so he falls in love with this beautiful princess at first sight. By the way, this is like halfway through the story. Like with a lot of these stories sort of go trundling along and then abruptly take a left turn into a completely different story than where we were. Anyway, so the young man in question falls in love with a princess of the jinn because he happened to see her, and he just, falls so much in love with her, and he starts, languishing and not eating, and, the usual things that happen when you apparently fall in love. Anyways, so through various events that include, among other things, effectively kidnapping the poor thing, he winds up married to her, and she eventually runs away because, that's what you do when somebody bullies you into marrying you. But anyways, so he makes his way back to the place where he first saw her, and he has some friends there, and he arrives there, and the youngest of them says, "Oh, it's good, you're back. I'm so happy to see you." And he passes out, and she's alarmed at this. And then he wakes up and says a couplet, and then passes out. And she is further alarmed. And then he wakes up and says a couplet, and then passes out. And then he wakes up and says a couplet, and then passes out. And then he wakes up and says a couplet, and then it's a thing where it's just like, I'm going to say 2 lines of poetry and then pass out again, because I am so racked with love that this is all I can do with myself, is recite bad poetry when I'm awake and then pass out. Anyway, so he has various exciting adventures and eventually gets the wife back, who is real sorry that she left him. They eventually make their way home again, and everybody's happy, more or less, sort of. It's like with a lot of these stories, it's weird. There are a lot of these stories. I mean, I've said it before. They're really, really weird at times, these stories. So there were a couple of things that caught my eye, and I have actually, I haven't made notes, I just made bookmarks. And among other things is, in the course of this story of the young man who basically wound up kidnapping the woman who he makes into his wife, and she runs away and all kinds of stuff, as they are trying to get home, at one point he says, and I quote, "Glory be to God, facilitator of the hard, fortifier of the weak heart, approximator of the far." And all I could think when I heard that was, what? God is what? Approximator of the far? I'm not even sure what that is. That just like God, the man who invented eyeballing distances? It's just unexpected, that one. I was also equally entertained. Where is it? I think I must have put the wrong Yeah, I must have put the wrong bookmark on. Anyway, so you have you have that story, um, but there are also stories of Khalifa or Caliph, the fisherman of Baghdad, and what happens with that is that we get a side note after the first version that I have followed the example of Mr. Payne and have translated in its entirety the tale of Khalifa the fisherman from the Breslau edit, Volume 4, pages 315 to 365, night 321 to 332, in preference to the unsatisfactory process of amalgamating it with that of the Mac edit given above. Anyways, so you have two versions of this story, the first of which has a lot of extraneous, unnecessary wibbling about weird stuff, and the second one, which is the same story but just has slightly less incredibly weird detail. And it's a story that starts with a fisherman, and the fisherman is basically, he's terrible at being a fisherman, and instead of, trying to find a new trade or something, just keeps on being a fisherman until the day comes that he throws his net into the water and pulls up an ape. And the ape basically says, "Hi, I'm your ape, and my job is to make your life suck. I make sure that you're poor." And he says, "Wow, you stink." And he goes fishing and he pulls up another ape, and that ape says, "I am the ape of that Jew, and I make sure that he gets lots of money and has a great life. So here's an idea. I will make sure that the next time you throw out your net, you get an awesome fish, and what you have to do is you have to go to the Jew and you have to tell him, I will sell you this fish if you promise to give me your ape in exchange for mine." And so the fisherman does this because two talking apes have basically convinced him this is a good idea. After some back and forth in which the Jew is attempting to, pay him for the fish or whatever, and he talks the Jew into it, and so they trade apes, and then we never hear from the apes again. That part of the story is over. Because in the meantime, the Caliph of the city has a slave girl that he is is totally enamored of, and his wife is really not happy about that. So she arranges for the slave girl to be drugged and stuffed into a trunk, and Caliph the fisherman manages to buy the trunk by sort of, various events happening. Oh yes, and I forgot the thing where he sees the Caliph and assumes that the Caliph stole his clothes. This guy's a weird guy, because after the whole thing with the apes, he's managed to make some money, and he says, "Oh no, I now have money. What if the Caliph decides he wants my money? I had better beat myself to prove that I am not a rich man," or something. And so he does that, and everybody, upon realizing that he has spent half the night beating himself, literally whipping himself, like a flagellant. I mean, because why not? And shouting that he's poor because he's concerned that the Caliph might steal his money, or just dude, you are nuts. You live in the bad part of town in a hovel. The Caliph is not going to ask you for money. Anyways, so he does that, but the next day he sees the Caliph walking along and thinks, because somebody made off with his clothes while he was in the water or whatever, that he thinks that the Caliph is the one who did it, and the Caliph eventually says, Here, have my outer robe. It's fine. You're being weird." But the fisherman he's just "You come along, I'll teach you how to fish," he says, having assumed that the Caliph, because he apparently looks like a trumpeter to the fisherman, he's just "Okay, I'll teach you how to fish, and then you'll have a different trade." And so the Caliph kind of goes along with this because he's slumming and thinks it's hilarious. Anyway, so various things happen, and the fisherman winds up with the caliph's slave girl who his wife, the caliph's wife, had basically said, "Oh yeah, honey, she died unexpectedly. She choked on something and just she died." And the caliph is just like completely grief stricken over this, and so eventually they get back together, and as a reward for taking care of his slave girl, he rewards the fisherman with stuff, and getting a lot of money means that the fisherman stops being weird and eventually becomes a normal person, albeit a very rich one, and everybody lives happily ever after until their deaths when God the destroyer of all good things came along, because all of these stories end that way. So you have that, which, is interesting enough. And then you have the story of Masrur and Zayn al-Mawasif, which is a story about justifying adultery, because Masrur is a guy who's walking along and he sees this woman who is so beautiful he just can't help himself, and he throws himself at her, and she's like, "Dude, I am married, no." And he's like, just give me a chance. And she's like, "Dude, I am married, no." But he keeps on going, and eventually she says, "Okay, how about this? I'm good at chess, and I think you probably stink at chess. So how about this? We'll play chess, and every time you lose, you pay me 10 dinars. And he's like, "Right. Okay, we will play chess, and eventually I'll win, and you'll agree to go out with me." And, so she beats him, and until he runs out of money, and he's like, "Wait right here. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to get more money." And he dashes off, and he goes home, and he gets more money, and he keeps playing chess games with her, losing 10 dinars per chess game, until he's completely out of money. And then he's like, "Okay, I'll give you all of my stuff." And so he plays chess against her until he loses his home and his slaves and his livelihood and his store and his everything. And she's like, you need to just, what? But eventually his sheer determination wins her over, and they have a wild affair until her husband comes home, at which point her husband, realizing that she has been cheating on him, decides to pick her up and cart her off somewhere else. And she keeps on writing letters to this guy, even though, she's married and everything. And eventually her husband loses patience with her and claps her in irons, at which point she basically goes to see... but when he does that, she's so beautiful that the blacksmith falls in love with her. And the blacksmith's like, "Oh, I have to get a judge. This is clearly something is wrong if he is clapping her in iron." So he goes to the judge, and the judge goes to see her and falls in love with her. And then she goes to see another judge, and she promises to marry 4 judges one after another. And then when she leaves town, after they all basically wrongfully imprison her husband and stuff, because she lies like a rug, she flees town, and everybody is left in despair because she is so beautiful that nobody can withstand her beauty. And they all just fall over in despair. And then she runs into a monastery, and the monks there, all 40 of them, fall in love with her, and she stays there for a few days, but they're all trying to hit on her, and so she eventually leaves, and all those 40 monks are filled with despair. And eventually she makes her way home and tells everybody, "Yeah, my husband is totally dead, and I have gone through the obligatory mourning period." Yes. And so she marries her actual the guy that she's in love with. And when her husband shows up, she has one of her sidekicks murder her husband, which is apparently totally okay if you're in love with the person that you got married or whatever. The end. Everybody lived happily ever after, except for the people in despair. I don't know. These are so weird, these stories. I'm having a great time. So that's all, and I will see you all next week.